In the year 304 AD, beneath the shadow of Roman persecution, a young Sicilian woman was led to her death. Her name was Lucy, a virgin who refused to bend to the empire's gods. Before the sword struck, her tormentors robbed her of something even more cruel, her eyes. Yet Lucy did not scream. She stood unbroken, her faith blazing brighter than fire. This is the story of the girl of Syracuse, the martyr who lost her sight, but whose vision outlived empires. The story of St. Lucy cannot be separated from the wider storm that swept the Roman Empire in the early 4th century, the Great Persecution. By 303 AD, Emperor Diocletian, alongside his co-ruler Maximian, unleashed the harshest edicts the Christian community had yet faced. Churches were torn down, sacred texts burned in the streets, and Christians across the empire were forced into the same terrible choice: renounce Christ by offering sacrifice to the Roman gods, or die. For the empire, this was not merely a question of religion, it was about control. The traditional Roman gods, with their temples and rituals, were the spiritual glue of the state. To reject them was not just impiety, it was treason. Diocletian believed that the unity of Rome depended on uniform worship. To allow Christians to defy that unity was, in his eyes, to court rebellion, and so he tried to break them. Sicily, the island where Lucy lived, was no safe refuge. Far from being a distant corner, it was a jewel of the Mediterranean, rich in grain and trade, tightly bound to imperial authority. Governors in Sicily were eager to enforce Rome's laws with precision, for failure to do so might cast suspicion upon themselves. In cities like Syracuse, Christians were not hidden. They were watched. They were recorded. Every act of devotion could become an act of defiance. It was into this world that Lucy came of age. To be Christian in Syracuse during these years was to live in constant fear. To pray in secret, to gather in hidden homes, was already dangerous. To refuse sacrifice when called before an official was a death sentence. And yet thousands did it. Men, women, even children chose confession over compromise. The persecutions were designed not only to kill, but to humiliate. Executions were public spectacles, staged in forums and amphitheaters, where crowds could jeer as bodies were burned, broken, or thrown to beasts. The empire's cruelty was a message. Faith would not outlast Rome. And yet, in city after city, martyrs emerged, whose courage burned brighter than the torches that consumed them. Lucy's story begins here, in the furnace of imperial terror. She was young, noble, and vulnerable, everything that should have ensured her obedience. But like so many others, she carried a conviction that Rome could not understand, that her life was not her own, that her body, her soul, her very eyes belonged to Christ. This conviction would set her on a path from obscurity to martyrdom, from an ordinary girl of Syracuse to one of the most enduring figures in Christian memory. The Age of Blood had no shortage of victims, but few shone with the defiance and light that Lucy would embody. When Rome sought to extinguish her, it would only scatter her light across the centuries, a light that refused to die. Lucy was born around the year 283 in the Sicilian city of Syracuse, a place steeped in both ancient Greek heritage and Roman power. She belonged to a noble family, which meant she was raised with privileges, education, servants, and connections. But her father died while she was still young, leaving her and her mother, Eutychia, vulnerable in a world where women without male protection were often subject to the designs of wealthier men. Despite the uncertainty, Lucy's household carried something rarer than fortune: faith. Christianity had already reached Sicily, carried by merchants and missionaries across the sea. Within the walls of her home, Lucy grew up hearing the gospel, praying in secret gatherings, and watching older believers risk their safety for the sake of their Lord. The faith she absorbed as a child would define her more than her noble blood ever could. At a young age, Lucy made a vow of virginity. In Roman society, this was not merely unusual, it was scandalous. Marriage was not just personal, it was political. Noble daughters were bargaining chips in the games of alliance and inheritance. By pledging her body solely to Christ, Lucy had declared independence from that entire system. She had removed herself from the marriage market, stripped her family of future power, and denied Rome its claim on her. This vow might have remained hidden had tragedy not intervened. Eutychia, her mother, fell gravely ill. Desperate for healing, Lucy traveled with her to Catania, to the shrine of another virgin martyr, Saint Agatha, who had been tortured and killed half a century earlier. There, Lucy prayed with fervor. According to tradition, Agatha appeared to her in a vision, assuring her that her mother would be cured. Soon after, Euticia's illness vanished. It was in this moment of miracle that Lucy revealed her vow. She told her mother she would never marry, that her life belonged to Christ, and that her dowry, the wealth her father had left, should be given to the poor. It was an act of defiance wrapped in piety. She was breaking with the expectations of her society and turning family fortune into charity. But Lucy was not free of suitors. One pagan man, enraged at the loss of both wealth and honor, saw her refusal as an insult too great to bear. In his bitterness, he betrayed her secret. He went to the governor, Pascasius, and accused her of being a Christian. It was a betrayal born not only of anger but of pride. For men of that time, a woman's body was property, and Lucy's vow was theft. By claiming herself for God, she had humiliated him. Now he would humiliate her by delivering her to Rome's machinery of persecution. The decision sealed Lucy's fate. Her youth, her beauty, her noble status, none of these could shield her now. She was marked, not by choice of her own, but by faith too radiant to be hidden. Syracuse, the city of philosophers and poets, would soon become the stage of her martyrdom. Lucy's vow of virginity, once hidden within the walls of her home, now became the central drama of her life. For the Roman world, virginity was not a choice of holiness, but a violation of duty. A young noblewoman was expected to marry, produce heirs, and extend the influence of her family. By refusing, Lucy was not simply rejecting a man, she was rejecting the system itself. When her mother's recovery confirmed her faith, Lucy turned even more fiercely toward her vow. She began distributing her dowry to the poor, giving away gold, land, and possessions that might have secured her a comfortable future. To the Christian community, she was becoming a beacon of charity, echoing the words of the gospel to sell what one had and give to the needy. To the outside world, however, she was draining her family's wealth, undermining the very structure of Roman aristocracy. The suitor she had spurned could not tolerate this. In Roman culture, male honor was tied to dominance and possession. Lucy's rejection humiliated him before his peers, while the loss of her fortune stripped him of a prize he believed was rightfully his. Pride turned quickly to vengeance. He reported her to the governor, Pascasius, a man charged with enforcing the emperor's edicts against Christians. Before Roman officials, Christians were offered what seemed like an easy way out. Burn incense before the gods, swear loyalty to the emperor, and walk free. Many, under the shadow of death, bent to this pressure. But Lucy's response was unwavering. When Pascasius demanded that she sacrifice, she declared firmly, "I belong to Christ. You cannot command what is already his." Her words were more than defiance, they were a public rejection of Rome's spiritual authority. In the governor's eyes, this was insubordination, a challenge that could not be ignored. If Lucy, a noble-born girl, could resist without fear, others might follow. Authority demanded her submission. Her faith guaranteed she would never give it. Her suitor's betrayal had set her on this path, but it was Lucy's vow that sealed her fate. In choosing virginity, she had chosen a kind of death long before the sword would pierce her body. She had renounced family ambition, marital security, and social respectability. What remained was a higher loyalty, one Rome could neither understand nor crush. For the early Christians, Lucy's refusal was not merely an act of stubbornness. It was a declaration that the empire's reach ended at the threshold of conscience. Her vow was her fortress, her faith, her weapon. The stage was set. The young girl of Syracuse would now stand in open defiance before the machinery of Rome, carrying only the strength of her conviction against the power of an empire. The trial of Lucy before Governor Pascasius was not held in secrecy. Like all Roman proceedings, it was a public affair, designed to instruct as much as to punish. In the Forum of Syracuse, Lucy was summoned to stand before the representative of imperial power. Her accuser, the suitor who had betrayed her, watched as his denunciation unfolded into a trial that would decide not only Lucy's fate, but the honor he sought to reclaim. Pascasius offered her the standard choice. The words were formulaic, spoken countless times to countless Christians. Sacrifice to the gods, swear loyalty to the emperor, and you will live. Refuse, and you will suffer the penalties of the law. To the governor, this was not cruelty but duty. He was the hand of Rome, and the law demanded obedience. Lucy, however, was unmoved. She answered with the calm certainty of one who had already died to the world. "I am the servant of Christ. My body is his, my soul is his, my life is his. You may not command what I have already given away." The crowd that gathered must have murmured in shock. Here was a noble-born girl, young and frail, yet speaking with a voice of authority. She stood against the empire with nothing but her faith, as though her words were stronger than the legions. For Paschasius, this was intolerable. It was not only disobedience, it was subversion. If one girl could speak so, others might believe they could too. Determined to break her, he ordered that Lucy be humiliated before she was killed. The punishment chosen was designed to strip her of her vow and her dignity. She was to be dragged to a brothel, forced into violation, and returned defiled. In the Roman system, shame could be as destructive as death. By attacking her purity, Paschasius sought to erase her example and silence her defiance. But even here, the story turned against him. Tradition tells that when soldiers tried to move her, Lucy became immovable. Ropes snapped, oxen strained, yet her body refused to be shifted. The crowd witnessed what they believed to be divine intervention, God himself anchoring her to the ground. What was meant as a spectacle of humiliation became a miracle of defiance. The trial had begun as a simple enforcement of imperial law. By the end, it had become a public demonstration of faith. Paschasius found himself not in control but mocked, his authority shaken by a girl he could not move. The Roman governor had no choice but to escalate. If humiliation could not silence Lucy, harsher torments would. The brothel could not claim her, but perhaps the fire would. In the logic of persecution, the empire would not stop until she was destroyed. The governor's command was clear. If Lucy would not yield her faith, then her purity would be broken. Paschasius believed that by subjecting her to humiliation, he could destroy the very foundation of her vow, proving that her resistance was futile. Thus, he ordered that she be dragged to a brothel, where her body would be dishonored and her virginity defiled. For the Roman mind, this punishment was more devastating than execution. Death could make a martyr, but shame could silence one forever. A woman defiled, they thought, would lose her dignity, her worth, her place as an example for others. By destroying her purity, the governor sought to make Lucy not a hero, but a warning. But when soldiers came to carry out the order, something extraordinary occurred. Tradition records that Lucy's body became immovable, anchored to the very ground of the square. The soldiers strained, pulling her with ropes, whipping the oxen that were yoked to drag her away. Yet, she did not budge. It was as if her slight frame weighed more than marble, as if the earth itself had conspired to keep her safe. To the crowd that watched, this was not merely resistance, it was a miracle. A young woman, barely more than a girl, could not resist the force of armed men and beasts. Yet here she stood, untouched, unbroken, immovable. Whispers spread that God himself had intervened, preserving her vow before the eyes of all. Paschasius was humiliated. What was meant as her disgrace had turned into his. Before the people of Syracuse, the power of Rome had faltered against the power of faith. The governor, however, could not admit defeat. Instead, he ordered harsher measures. If she could not be moved by force, perhaps she could be destroyed by fire. But Lucy herself, in that moment, turned the humiliation into triumph. Accounts tell that she declared aloud that it was not human strength holding her there, but the Spirit of God. She was unafraid of the brothel, unafraid of death, because she had already surrendered herself to Christ. Her purity was not her own possession, but his protection. No force of men or beasts could break what was sealed by faith. For the early Christians who later told her story, this moment was the pinnacle of her defiance. Lucy, the Virgin of Syracuse, had defeated the empire without lifting a hand, without a weapon, without violence. She had resisted by the sheer power of her vow, a vow that Rome could not bend. Enraged by failure, Paschasius escalated Lucy's punishment. If she could not be moved to shame, then she would be reduced to ashes. A pyre was built, wood heaped high around her body. The governor intended to burn her alive in the public square, making of her a spectacle of terror that would quench the whispers of miracle and faith. The flames were lit, and the smoke rose into the sky. Yet Lucy did not scream, nor did her body blacken in the fire. Tradition tells that the flames licked around her but refused to consume her. The soldiers fanned the blaze, the crowd watched in awe, but Lucy stood amid the inferno untouched, as though the fire itself recoiled from her presence. This was not the first time Christians had been subjected to fire. From Rome to Africa, the empire had used flames as both execution and entertainment. But here in Syracuse, the fire betrayed its masters. Instead of destroying Lucy, it testified to her sanctity. Witnesses would later swear that she stood calm, her face serene, her body shining with a light that the flames could not dim. To the governor, The scene was intolerable. Every failed attempt to destroy Lucy only deepened her legend. Her immovable body had already mocked Roman strength. Now the unburned pyre mocked Roman cruelty. Paschasius's authority was unraveling before his own soldiers. The crowd no longer saw a criminal, they saw a saint. Lucy's defiance grew louder. Accounts tell us she proclaimed that the fire could not harm her because of the protection of God, the same God who preserved the 3 young men in the furnace of Babylon. By invoking scripture, she turned her suffering into testimony, linking her story to the ancient chain of martyrs who triumphed over worldly power. In that moment, the flames did not merely fail, they revealed. They revealed that Lucy's faith was stronger than Rome's wrath, that her purity was untouched, her vow unbroken, her soul beyond reach. The empire could command fire and sword, but it could not command conscience. Paschasius, consumed by rage, abandoned subtlety. If humiliation could not defeat her, and fire could not consume her, then he would turn to brutality more direct and more savage. The next order would not aim at shame or miracle, it would aim at mutilation. Lucy's trial had reached a climax. The girl who could not be moved, the virgin who could not be burned, would now face the most harrowing torment of all. The empire, determined to extinguish her light, would strike at the very symbol of her vision, her eyes. In the eyes of the governor, Lucy had become more than a prisoner, she had become a public challenge. Each attempt to break her had failed, and the crowd was no longer laughing at her plight, but whispering about miracles. To silence her, Paschasius turned to a punishment, both symbolic and cruel. Her eyes would be torn out. In Roman culture, the gaze carried power. To meet the eyes of another was to exchange honor or shame. Lucy's steadfast gaze, calm, unflinching, unwavering, had become unbearable to her accusers. Her eyes seemed to accuse them of weakness, of futility, of cruelty. To remove them was to remove the symbol of her defiance, to disfigure her so completely that she could no longer be revered as pure or whole. Accounts differ on how this horror unfolded. Some traditions say soldiers were ordered to gouge out her eyes, leaving her disfigured in the square. Others insist that Lucy herself plucked them out and handed them to her persecutors, a shocking act of defiance that robbed them of the power to violate her. In both versions, the result is the same. Lucy was left blind before her execution. Yet blindness did not silence her. Instead, it magnified her faith. Christian witnesses testified that even without her eyes, her face shone with serenity, as though she still saw something no tormentor could understand. Her vision, they believed, was no longer of this world, but of eternity. The mutilation that was meant to degrade her instead transformed her into a symbol of deeper sight that no empire could destroy. Later tradition would make this moment central to her identity. Artists depicted Lucy, carrying her eyes on a dish, serene and composed, her face unscarred, her light unextinguished. The irony was complete. The woman whose eyes were taken became the patron saint of sight. Her mutilation became her crown. For the governor, however, this was not enough. Even blind, Lucy remained unbroken. Even mutilated, she inspired awe. Paschasius could no longer afford delay. He ordered that she be executed at once, hoping that death, if not shame or fire, would finally silence her. Lucy's story had reached its most brutal chapter. The empire had struck at her purity, her body, her very eyes, and still she stood, a beacon of faith in the darkness of persecution. But now, the sword would fall. The final order was swift. Lucy was to be killed. Soldiers drew their swords, and the young virgin who had defied an empire was led to the place of execution. Tradition holds that she was pierced through the throat, a cruel and intimate wound meant to rob her of voice as well as life. Yet even in her dying, Lucy spoke. Accounts say she prayed for the church, for the faithful, even for her persecutors. Her words echoed the prayers of Christ on the cross, the forgiveness of Stephen the martyr, the mercy of saints who saw beyond cruelty to the souls of their tormentors. Her executioners could silence her body, but not her faith. For the crowd of Syracuse, her death was more than a punishment, it was a revelation. Here was a girl, young and fragile, who had resisted every attempt to break her. She had stood immovable against soldiers, survived fire, endured mutilation, and finally met death with serenity. Her execution, intended as a warning, became instead an example. Whispers of miracles soon surrounded her grave. Some said her sight was restored in death. Others claimed that healings occurred at the place of her burial. The Christians of Syracuse began to venerate her, not as a victim, but as a saint. Rome had sought to erase her memory, but her story only spread wider. her suitor's betrayal, the governor's cruelty, the empire's wrath, all were consumed by the fire of her testimony. In death, Lucy's light grew stronger. She became the virgin martyr of Syracuse, her name spoken with reverence, her feast kept with candles and prayers. For the early Christians, her death held a lesson. Rome's violence could kill the body but not the soul. It could gouge out eyes, but not erase vision. Lucy's final breath was not defeat, but victory, the triumph of faith over empire, purity over corruption, light over darkness. In Syracuse, the memory of her sacrifice spread quickly, whispered in homes, written in chronicles, carved into the faith of her community. The young woman who had stood against Rome with nothing but her vow had become a symbol that would outlive emperors and armies. Lucy's martyrdom was not the end of her story, but the beginning of her legend. From the silence of her grave would rise the sound of prayers, songs, and devotion that stretched across centuries. Rome had meant to extinguish her, but instead, it had lit a flame that could not be put out. By the 5th century, Lucy's story had already crossed the seas and spread beyond the walls of Syracuse. Her tomb became a site of pilgrimage, her relics revered by Christians who saw in her martyrdom the triumph of light over empire. The cult of Saint Lucy flourished not only in Sicily but throughout Italy, as churches began to bear her name and altars were raised in her honor. Art quickly seized upon her image. In mosaics and frescoes, she was depicted as serene, holding the palm branch of martyrdom, and often, a small dish carrying her eyes. It was a striking symbol. The saint whose eyes were gouged became the one who could see most clearly, not with earthly vision, but with eternal sight. Medieval worshippers, gazing upon these images, found in her calm expression not horror but peace, a reminder that even mutilation could be transfigured into glory. Her feast day, December 13th, became one of the most celebrated in the Christian calendar. Falling near the winter solstice, the darkest day of the year, it symbolized the return of light, the promise that even in the longest night, dawn was coming. This connection between Lucy and light was no accident. Her very name, derived from lux, means light. For Christians living under the shadow of persecution, her name was not only a memory, it was a prophecy. As centuries passed, her veneration expanded northward into Scandinavia. There, her feast intertwined with ancient festivals of fire and renewal. Girls dressed in white robes, crowned with wreaths of candles, processed through darkened towns, bringing bread and light in her name. Santa Lucia became not just a Sicilian martyr, but a symbol of hope in the frozen winters of the north. In Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, her festival continues to this day, a blending of Christian devotion and folk tradition, marking her as one of the most enduring saints across cultures. Sailors also took her as their protector. Just as they once prayed to Saint Erasmus when storms threatened, they invoked Lucy to guide them across treacherous seas. Her eyes, once gouged out, became a metaphor for navigation and clarity. She became a patron not only of the blind, but of those who sought guidance, those who needed light in dark places. In art, in liturgy, in festival, Lucy's presence grew. The empire that killed her had long since crumbled, but her story remained, embedded in the living memory of the Church. Her mutilation, once meant to erase her, became the very symbol by which she was remembered. The Virgin of Syracuse, the martyr of sight, had become an icon of resilience, charity, and unbreakable vision. 17 centuries have passed since Lucy fell beneath the sword in Syracuse, but her story still burns with power. The empire that sought to crush her is gone. Its emperors are remembered in ruins and fragments of stone. Yet Lucy's name is spoken in cathedrals, whispered in kitchens, carried in candlelit processions across continents. Her light has outlasted Rome. Lucy remains the patron saint of the blind, of the persecuted, of those who refuse to yield when pressured by power. Her feast day, marked by flames and hymns, reminds the faithful that sight is more than eyes, that vision is more than flesh. In a world that often confuses power with truth, Lucy's story insists that true vision comes from faith, and that faith cannot be gouged out, burned, or silenced. Her eyes, torn from her face in violence, became her crown in eternity. They symbolize a paradox at the heart of martyrdom, that the instruments of cruelty become the signs of glory, that what is stolen in death is restored in life everlasting. Lucy's mutilation was not the end of her story, but the beginning of her legend, a legend that continues to inspire those who face darkness with courage. In every generation, her witness has posed the same question: what is worth suffering for? To Lucy, The answer was clear. Her vow was worth more than her life. Her purity was worth more than her safety. Her faith was worth more than Rome's approval. She reminds us that there are values higher than survival, truths brighter than empire, visions that no cruelty can extinguish. Candles still burn in her name, not merely as acts of remembrance but as symbols of resistance against despair. From Sicily to Scandinavia, from catacombs to cathedrals, from winter nights to quiet prayers, Lucy's light endures. Her martyrdom is not a relic of the past but a challenge for the present. Will we see as she saw, with eyes fixed not on fear, but on eternity? The young girl of Syracuse, whose body could not be moved, whose purity could not be broken, whose eyes could not be silenced, stands as one of history's most radiant martyrs. She lived in an age of blood, but she did not yield to darkness. Her vision, once thought destroyed, continues to illuminate across centuries. Lucy's death, meant as erasure, became illumination. Her eyes, meant as trophies of cruelty, became windows of faith. And so, in every flame lit in her memory, in every hymn sung on her feast, her story is told again, the Virgin whose light could not be put out.